Hello, good morning. All right, so let me get the names down and we will go ahead and jump into this material. So now we are working on what I'd like to do is go over a little bit on the Northern Colonies assignment, as well as test number 1. All right, and let you get a feel for how I subjectively put my tests together. And so, yeah, you have multiple choice format, and you also have I think, a couple true false. I had some questions based upon a textbook, and I haven't checked yet if I have failed or succeeded in eliminating those questions. But obviously, if I have failed to do such, you will receive those answers, needless to say. So let's see here. So with the Northern Colonies assignment, the theme that usually I have it revolve around is American exceptionalism. The Northern Colonies and their historiography and their writing of history of their own region, it's oftentimes can be tied to the Civil War. They depict themselves as being very progressive, very ahead of their time, at the forefront of change, etc. And so it begins with going over their demographic. Would you have a gentleman named David Hackett Fisher, and he has a book called New Albion, and it contends that the socioeconomic class, the category of the population, the demographic of people that primarily migrated to the Northern Colonies and inhabited them were from the city. That's what bourgeoisie really is people of the city. And so, yeah, it's something to begin with. And you think about today, right? You think about people in San Francisco, New York City, and so forth. You can make the assertion that they're at the forefront of change, whether it be fashion, whether it be cultural norms, values, etc. And so that's what they're going to contend here. Another component that is very relevant to the topic is the poor soil in the New England area. Supposedly, it's very gravel-like. It's not nitrogen rich at all. And so almost by necessity, Rosalind, I just mentioned that I'd like to go over the test today. And if there are any questions on the textbook, because obviously I haven't required the textbook, the semester is just too condensed. I didn't want to throw that on you as well. So if I have failed to omit those questions on the textbook, I'm going to give you the answers, needless to say. Okay. And so at any rate, no problem. Let's see here. I think I'm almost done. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the page. But with New England, for instance, as you see here in the Northern Colonies, the soil is poor. Many of them were bourgeois coming from cities in England or around cities. And so hence they did not engage in cash crop, slave labor-based farming as they did in the Chesapeake region of Virginia, in the Carolinas, and later in Georgia, etc. Right? But they're going to embrace diversification. They're going to diversify. They're going to later on industrialize. All right. And so they claim that they were at the forefront, not just by accident or by happenstance with the soil, but because of the very class that so many of them came from. They were people of the city, of the bourgeoisie. So at any rate, you have that in number 1. You see how their church was vital, an integral part to their institutions, their culture. You had to be a member of the church to be a full-fledged citizen of their colonies. Um, but the church was relative to the Catholic Church, relative to the Anglican Church, uh, more democratic. You had congregational churches whereby the people elected their own pastors, and quote unelect them and get them out. You had some Presbyterians, and they elected their own elders who ran the church and chose the pastor, etc. But a lot of them, they did not have like a bishop who had to answer to an archbishop, etc. And that type of episcopal hierarchical organization that the Catholic Church has. And the New Englanders were proud of that. Let's see here. They had their famous New England town hall meetings, where all the citizens could get together and anyone could bring forth a measure to be voted upon, and so forth. So they had a democratic element to their government as well as to their church organization. And so you could read about that in number one. They also began Harvard in 1636, and you could make the argument that their epistemology, their approach to knowledge, was not as dogmatic as some of the other churches, right? What I mean by dogmatic is that, church leaders say this, and therefore it must be the gospel truth, and you have to adhere to it. You can't dare defy or challenge the beliefs that you're being indoctrinated with. With the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they contended that, and this is arguable, that they were more empirical, like the five senses and the scientific method, etc., and that they had a more empirical avenue to knowledge and to the acceptance of knowledge. And so they were scientifically oriented. They did vaccines far ahead of their time. Their study of the human body and animals, the animal kingdom, etc., was in some ways arguably ahead of their time. And so they were proud of that. They also practiced a somewhat open capitalist economy, where people were free to engage in whatever type of work they wanted to work in, at least relative to the South. With the South, arguably, the leaders of especially later on, like South Carolina, etc., they followed more faithfully patronage. And patronage, you had to have royal permission to engage in whatever you were engaging in economically, as a career. So at any rate, an occupation. And so at any rate, take a look at number one and see what you think. And also the Pilgrims, like with the famous Thanksgiving story, they established an alliance based on equality with Massasoit and the Wampanoag Confederacy tribe of tribes. And so, namely against the Narragansett tribe and others that threatened the Wampanoag. And so they had a mutual alliance, and that was very anomalous, very rare for that time. Because, for instance, with the Native Americans, they had a term agua, kind of like the Spanish agua, but with a W. And it meant subordinated to or underneath. And oftentimes you were subordinated to another tribe and you had to pay them tribute. And usually it was whatever kind of commodity that your area had to offer, or in men to fight as warriors, mercenary warriors, etc. And so they had that practice, that tradition, that legacy, but yet they had a treaty of equality with the Pilgrims, and that entailed equality of justice, which was very rare at that time period with the Pilgrims. That is if a Pilgrim were to go into Wampanoag territory and commit a crime, the Pilgrims would hand him or her over to the Wampanoag Confederacy and let them try him or her by their own practices and institutions. And then likewise, if a Wampanoag Native American were to come into Plymouth and commit a crime, he was held by English pilgrim standards to justice. And so again, that is relatively rare. And the Pilgrims could boast, right, that they formed their alliance at the end of 1620, and they did not have a war with the Native Americans until 1674. And so they made it 54 years without a war. The Puritans, however, could not say the same. And see the difference, right? Massachusetts Bay Colony is the Puritan colony, established 10 years later in 1630, centered around Boston. And Plymouth, the famous landing of the Pilgrims, was 10 years prior to that, 1620, in this region right here, the Cape Cod region. So notice, right, that the Pilgrims were a lot less controversial than the Puritans. The Puritans came in 1630, and they were already at war by 1636 with the Pequot tribe. And then they joined in on Metacomet's war with the Pilgrims in 1674. And they had fighting and massacres in the interim between 1636 and 1674 as well. They did not have a treaty of alliance with the Wampanoags, nor with the Narragansett or any other tribe of the New England area. And they, on more than one occasion, people reported from Plymouth back to England itself to basically tell on the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, contending that they were lording power over their neighbors, English neighbors, as well as Native American neighbors. And then as another side note, the Connecticut River Valley, right in here, this was lush land, highly coveted, and people from Plymouth, as well as Massachusetts Bay, came flooding in and squatting on that real estate. And multiple Native American tribes took exception to that and even gave ultimatums to the Plymouth colony and to the Massachusetts Bay colony to get their Englishmen and women out of their ancestral land. So then number two, I take a 180, and it's again mainly the Puritans, more so than the Pilgrims, and I show how exclusivist they were, intolerant they were, paranoid they were, and also brutal. You could look up the well, with the Pilgrims themselves, the first Thanksgiving was preceded by the Wessagusett raid, and that's when Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoags, was on his deathbed supposedly, and the English brought a doctor to come help him, and he got better. And he said, "Oh, by the way, the Massachusetts tribe are about to attack your outpost." And so they had a guy named Miles Standish, the Pilgrims, and he was their fighter. And he came in and feigned a diplomatic meeting with the Massachusetts warriors. And while they were eating, he had them massacred. And then they celebrated that the threat had abated and that their military alliance had worked. And so that's something that we missed as children, right? In the narrative of Thanksgiving, the Wessagusett raid. And then with the Puritans, oftentimes what stands out is the Fort Mystic massacre. The Pequot tribe, they came into Fort Mystic, and they were hiding, and it was highly flammable, and the Puritans set it on fire, and those who tried to run from the flames were mercilessly shot down and killed, including elderly women and children. And the Puritans bragged, they boasted about it, contending that their Christian God had given them the victory. And so, kind of like the Spanish, the Puritans, when they fought, they could fight viciously and then supposedly in the name of God to justify their brutality. And so, Yeah, so you look up the case of Proud Miantonomi. He was a sub sachem, a sub chief of the, I want to say, the Narragansett, yeah, tribe, and he tried to tell on the Puritans, and the Puritans had him murdered. And so you have incidents like that that are indicting of the Puritans. And then also they could be very intrusive into the people's lives with their notion of the covenant, as you see here. With their notion of the covenant, they get it from the Old Testament of the Bible, whereby the Hebrew God of the Old Testament tells his Hebrew people, right? If your people behave, if they follow my 10 commandments, if they follow my moral code, I will bless them. I will bless their crops. I will bless them economically. I will bless their health. I will bless them in battle and for their safety, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you know where this is going. But then the Old Testament, God says, but if they stray from me and they sin against me, then I'm going to leave them to the devices of the devil, and I'm going to let their enemies defeat them. Their crops go awry, their health succumb to disease, et cetera, et cetera. So the Puritans embraced that, and so they had people called select men, and they would come and spy on the church people, and everyone was mandated to go to church, but not everyone was accepted as a church member. But you still had to go, or you could be fined or worse. And so, at any rate, they would come and spy on the people in their private lives to make sure they were not up to no good, so to speak. And then ultimately, right, I just gave the basic narrative. And then you have those who dared to disagree and challenge what the authorities were preaching and mandating. And the two famous cases are Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. So just take a quick look at that, and you'll see their cases. I gave just the basics to them, but there was no tolerance for such. And then this is not an argumentative section. It's just kind of an FYI section. I give the basics to the Salem witch trials that the Puritans were responsible for in 1692 and 1693. Right. And then moving on to Pennsylvania. So with Pennsylvania as a northern colony, let's go back up here. It was, shoot, it's not on that map. So New Netherlands, New York. So Pennsylvania would be off this page. But at any rate, Pennsylvania was unique in that it was a proprietary colony owned by one man, William Penn, right? There was a debt owed his father. His father passed away, and so it was given to him. It was from military service, and with King James, he had fought with mercenaries and with his own weapons, paid his own soldiers to fight for the king, and the king owed him. So at any rate, this great parcel of fertile land was granted to this young, spoiled, rich kid, William Penn. Okay. But what goes on is court history. Remember, court history, like in a court, C-O-U-R-T, that's when like an emperor tells his or her scribe, I want a history written of me and my kingdom. Well, obviously, right? The facts that scribe chooses to select, the manner by which that scribe interprets those facts and presents those facts is going to be in such a way to make that emperor look wonderful, right? If he wants to keep his head. And likewise, court history praises the leaders, praises the country, right? So we've all been acquainted with court history, very likely when we were in elementary school at the least, praising presidents, uh, patriotic in tone, contending that we're in an exceptional country, a country that is special, that stands out, right? And in what way, oftentimes, does court history contend that we're special and we stand out? Was one, right? I bet I could get these answers from you. One is that it's a country of exceptional opportunity for more people than is often available to people in other countries. So it's a land of opportunity, right? And then secondly, that this country is exceptional in that it is idealistic and that it doesn't just promote uh, economic enrichment, uh, power grabbing, but that it is a land of ideals that everyone ought to believe in, like the equality of all people. So when we get to the Declaration of Independence, right, and you get to the Enlightenment, you get a lot of specificity that we'll cover in those claims about us being a special country. So it begins here, not only in New England, as I mentioned before, that they're relatively more democratic, that they were forward looking, that they were idealistic, but also with Pennsylvania. And court history has held on pretty well with William Penn. Uh, and the interpretation is that his religious conversion helped bring out the best in him. That sometimes we see the ugly side of religious influence, right, with holy wars, etc., and witch hunts. But sometimes you see a much brighter side to religious influence. And this is the case in court history on William Penn, that he became a Quaker, and the Quakers were very egalitarian. Everyone is to be put on equal footing. There's a Bible verse that says God is not a respecter of persons, that he doesn't demarcate ranks and titles and power, etc., that everyone is on equal footing in God's sight, equally valuable, important, etc. And so hence, in becoming a Quaker, he went out of his way to, for one, share political power, because when you look at the initial charter given to him, he was the sole proprietor. I mean, the buck stopped with him. He could decide laws. The only limitation that was put upon him was that the laws should not contradict those of Mother England by the king. But besides that, he could enact what he wanted. But instead, he allowed a legislative body to form. And so they passed laws and he could veto them or approve them. And so hence he didn't need to do that, arguably, but he did in the court history narrative. And then secondly, he went out of his way to provide land to people, not only to many people of various ranks, but arguably he even went out of his way to provide land to the marginalized, to the poor, and those who had not had a piece of the pie, so to speak, back in Europe. He sent brochures and literature to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to the German states, etc., to poor farmers, to the urban poor and homeless, supposedly in England and Bristol, Liverpool, and London. And so he went out of his way to provide cheap, and in some cases, the initial, I can't remember how many people, but the initial people to subscribe to move to Pennsylvania actually received free land, free of charge. And he also had his famous almshouses. And almshouses were like, kind of reminds me of the gospel mission locally, whereby the homeless and destitute could come. They would be taught a trade. They would be granted basic necessities to get on their feet economically, and to be provided an employment opportunity. And so the almshouses, they'll eventually spread, but their genesis began in Pennsylvania. And so with William Penn. And then not only that, he has a famous clause whereby he allows freedom of conscience. And this was anomalous. This was out of the ordinary for his time period, to allow even atheists. And, that's not a big deal to us now, having had the Enlightenment and classical liberalism and other movements that we'll talk about later affect our culture and our institutions here in the US. But back then, that was out of the ordinary, because like with the Puritans, right? You had to convince the church leaders that you had had a born again experience. As you may recall in the New Testament, Jesus says you have to be born again to go to heaven. And so the argument is the belief, along with the Catholic Church, in original sin, that people are tainted with a natural proclivity to do bad, to sin against God, that it comes naturally to human beings from birth. And so their notion of the depravity of man could only be rectified by being born again. And specifically with being born again, the idea of the Holy Spirit, of the Trinity, coming and living inside of you to help make a better person out of you. So the Puritans did not trust anyone with power at all that was not acceptably born again. And you had to have letters of rec and testimonials, etc. It was strict. So when it comes to William Penn, he does contend that to run for the legislator, you have to be a Christian. Even William Penn said that, because he had the same belief in the depravity of man, and the only people with the Holy Spirit in them can have a chance of being morally upright as politicians. But as a citizen and being entitled to citizenship rights, it didn't matter. So not a very big stretch by today's standards, but for back then, that was pretty impressive. So freedom of conscience, including being an atheist or agnostic. So at any rate, you have those types of facts that are brought into court history. But then it's followed by contending that William Penn was a puzzle of a man, an enigma. Then you get more into a utilitarian side of him. Firstly, while he did give economic opportunities to a lot of people, the best, most fertile land in choice spots, he reserved for himself and his people in his inner circle. And he was constantly trying to enrich himself with business pursuits. Also, you see a sense in which he seemed insatiable, just incapable of ever becoming satisfied, in trying to lure the Native Americans to sell more and more of their lands. Now, granted, he stood out in a positive light for demanding that Native Americans must consent to the relinquishment of their lands. And that was out of the ordinary, because the Puritans, by contrast, Jamestown and Virginia, by contrast, they had no qualms with just grabbing lands, confiscating lands from Native Americans without their permission. So he insisted that Native Americans consent to the relinquishment of their lands, but he was always pressuring them. They called him, in their Algonquin language, the feather or the quill pen, the guy who always had, a desire to sign up a new treaty and purchasing more and more lands from the Native Americans. And it got to a point where, if he had really had the deep concern and empathy for the Native Americans that he demonstrated in many ways, then why was he not concerned about them eventually giving up all their lands. And so a puzzle of a man, because when you look at his day-to-day dealings, his diplomacy with the Native Americans demonstrated, at least symbolically, the utmost respect. Um, he followed their protocol in their meetings. They would change every other year. One year, the natives would come to him in Philadelphia. The next year, he would go to them, to their spot, and he learned their native languages. He smoked the peace pipe with them, etc. But I'm suggesting on this one that it might have been utilitarian, trying to use them. And so that's a negative facet to William Penn that revisionist historians have brought to light later. And by revisionist, I mean you want to change or revise the court interpretations to a topic, right? So as you can guess, court history is very positive, very uplifting. Some people think to the point of being a little bit naive. And then revisionist history is oftentimes negative, cynical, right, and wanting to revise such. So then number 5, tolerance in colonial New Netherlands was primarily an economic decision. So what you'll read about here is some similarities with Pennsylvania, whereby the New Netherlands, or as we call it now, New York, because the Dutch were the first European colonizer before the English took it from them. And the Dutch, right, when you look back at their government, the Hague, and their their Reformation movement against the Catholic Church in Spain, which was colonizing the Netherlands and kicking Spain out, they were more tolerant than many European countries. In fact, when the English fought against the Anglican Church back in England, a lot of them sought refuge in the Netherlands because they knew the Netherlands had Muslims, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Catholics, etc. And they were allowed to coexist in places like Amsterdam. So at any rate, here in New Amsterdam, which was New York City, the Dutch are going to allow the establishment of Muslim mosques and of Jewish synagogues, which was very rare, very, again, out of the ordinary, very anomalous for its time. But when you look at the proceedings, they often said, as their rationale, as long as they are helping the colony gain profits, let them be. So I'm being highly cynical, perhaps too cynical on this last number. And I'm saying the Dutch don't deserve credit for being exceptionally tolerant. Yes, relatively tolerant compared to their neighbors, but a lot of their drive behind it was simply to make money, not so much in the name of tolerance itself. So take a look, see if you think it's sufficiently supported, or if you think I'm being too hard on the Dutch. All right. So now moving to the let me stop sharing. Let me see if I could get to, oh shoot. All right, so Northern Colonies, history test number 1. So you see here, which of the following is an alleged reason for which knowledge of Native American culture and history is incomplete? Lack of sufficient written Native American sources, absolutely. C. Vance Haynes' theory on immigration does not dovetail with carbon dated objects, true as well. Alleged cultural, linguistic, and biological ties between Native Americans and indigenous Siberians, yes, that is true. European chronicles are alleged by many to be ethnocentric and skewed. Those are all true. All right. Which of the following points was not conveyed concerning Native American cultural achievements? European colonizers and modern academia usually look for evidence of manipulation of the environment, et cetera, et cetera. That's all true. Considering the isolation of the Americans, the natives' Neolithic or New Stone Tool or farming revolution was relatively early, according to the book 1491. Yes. That evidence for alleged signs of civilization within future U.S. territory appear earliest in the American Southwest and along the Mississippi. That has also been stated. And D, that the Plains tribes met criteria for civilized status first. No, that's the one that doesn't fit. So every now and then I ask you to choose the false one rather than the true one. What was mentioned as common cultural traits shared by many American tribes despite their diversity? Remember, this was the last number of assignment number 1. And what should stand out to you is option A. And many of you chose that one and did well on it. Number 4, 2 stereotypical images of Native Americans commonly portrayed in European chronicles are, this is number 2 of assignment number 1, are innocent and childlike or bestial savages. That is absolutely true. 5, even by today's standards, Spanish colonization of the Americas was democratic, pluralistic, and tolerant. No, certainly not by today's standards, right? That's part of the Black Legend. And that was number 3 on the assignment on the Black Legend. So many of these, you guys, you could find the answers to them in the assignments, in the written assignments. At the time of Spanish colonization of the Americas, Western Europe was arguably slowly transitioning toward a limitedly and brutally capitalistic economy. That's exactly the point made on number 1 in the Southern Colonies handout, right? That was due last night. Number 7, which of the following was not arguably an historical contribution by the Spanish to the Americas? A monotheistic belief in the Christian God? Yes. Elements of law we have borrowed from Rome and Germanic sources? Yes. Modern notions of private ownership of property and of urban development? Yes. The Spanish brought all these things. I know this is court history, but there's truth to it. D, they had to teach Native American tribes how to cultivate the land? Of course not. Native Americans were cultivating the land virtually everywhere but the Pacific coast in California. To give credit where credit may or may not be due, the Spanish were arguably more apt to allow, quote, Negro or Negro slaves to buy their freedom. Yes, that's found in the Black Legend handout. They had a system of accountability known as the juez de residencia. That is true. So both of those are true, as stated in option C. Number 9, Las Casas, his breve relación, his brief relation of the destruction of the Indies book, openly sympathized with Native Americans who he labeled as meek sheep. And yes, that is found in the Black Legend handout. Castile, remember, he tried to counter Las Casas' account as a conquistador who fought under and with Cortez. His Historia Verdadera, his true history, as he said, implying that Las Casas was false. Somewhat justified Spanish conquest of the Aztec? Absolutely. Number 11, Sahagún was subjectively used by the instructor as evidence for the contention by some that by today's standards, even those early modern Euro-Americans who showed great intentions of treating natives well were not above the assumption that paternalistic action be taken. And that is true. Sahagún was the guy famous for the codices. Remember the Aztec books that were written in hieroglyphics? He had young Aztec boys convert to Catholic Christianity and translate into Spanish writing what each of the hieroglyphics on the pages meant to convey. And so he really wanted to preserve Aztec culture for the future, to be able to read about and learn. Nevertheless, he still insisted that they be forcibly converted to Catholic Christianity. And he has a famous quote where he shows empathy for the natives of Mexico engaging in child sacrifice to a rain god. And he contends that it's the devil who was deceiving them into doing such carnal things, horrible things, and that religious conversion would fix that. Number 12, Junipero Serra, the leader of the famous sacred expedition, right, of 1769 into California with the 21 missions, was discussed regarding the historiographical debate about, one, who would prevail in a dancing contest. Every now and then I throw a silly one out there. Of course not. B, the ruthlessness with which conquistadors abused the blank check. No, not him. Cortez, but not him. Not this priest. C, the juxtaposition of praises for Spanish mission friars as benevolent, paternalistic defenders of the Native Americans' rights, with criticism of them as ethnocentric tyrants, wanting to impose Spanish culture, norms, and beliefs upon the natives. C is the one. Okay, that's part of historical debate on Serra. So each of these gentlemen, I feel, represent an idea or an argument in the writing of history. That's why I chose them. Don Juan de Oñate, the guy who came in 1599 into New Mexico, was subjectively mentioned in class as a perfect case challenging the Black legend in that multiculturalism and democracy were practiced in New Mexico. No way. I believe I made the contention that if I personally had a professor tell me, I want you to write a narrative that adheres to the Black legend, that depicts the Spanish as an anti-model of how we don't want to be today, I would probably choose New Mexico, and starting with Oñate, with their ruthlessness and tyranny that they imposed on the Pueblo people there. Number 14, which of the following does not constitute a region of modern U.S. first claimed by the Spanish explorers and adelantados? De Soto claimed the deep south east of the Mississippi? Yes. Coronado claimed the present southwest? Yes. Cabrillo and later Serra and Portola claimed present-day California? Yes. Ponce de Leon claimed modern-day Massachusetts? No. He claimed Florida, the southeast, not the northeast. So that's the one that's wrong, and the one that doesn't fit, the one you should choose. Number 15, which of the following was not mentioned in characterizing Spanish colonization of the Americas? The Spanish colonizers were, by today's standards, religiously ethnocentric. By today's standards, yes. So were the English, etc. Spanish authorities generally intended the Spanish Americas to be hierarchical? Yes, as you see in number 3 of that assignment. C, the Spanish colony of New Mexico was depicted as anomalously tolerant and democratic. This is a bit redundant. Absolutely not. So C is the one that doesn't fit, and you should pick. All right. So here we go. 16 through 9, at least 16 and 17. Let's see here. I'm absolutely going to give you because you shouldn't have one from the textbook. The textbook illustrates how French colonization exercised an influence disproportionate to their numbers, largely because of their relationship with Native Americans. It cites as an example French intrusion into the Native American fur trade. That is true. According to the textbook that I usually use, that is contended. True. Number 17, the textbook claims that rigid royal Spanish policy stifled economic development in the Americas, as opposed to being free, open, and capitalistic. That also is true. All right, so both the textbook questions are true. Number 18, a section from the Southern Colonies handout contends that colonial Virginia afforded an economically and politically equal playing field for all English colonists. No way. Remember, the South is depicted, as opposed to the North, as being archaic, old school, and inequitable, politically and economically unequal and unfair. Number 19, court American history portrayed John Smith as the embodiment of American leadership by merit or talent. Yes, that is true. And you find that in like number 3, 2 or 3 of the assignment on the Southern Colonies. Then it's followed in the next section with Helen Roundtree. depicts the encounter between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in English court history fashion? No way. She does not defend the English, if you clearly look over that section. She glosses over ethical components? No way. But look at C. From the perspective of the Native American Powhatan Confederacy, depicting the latter as patient, long-suffering, and tactical, while portraying the English as greedy, dishonest, and ungrateful. So C is the one that encapsulates what Roundtree's book covers. Number 21, the Southern Colonies handout highlighted instances of agency being recognized amongst WASP minorities, which was not mentioned. The Powhatan Confederacy's leadership arguably could have easily wiped out the small original English settlement at Jamestown if it wanted to. Yes, that's under Roundtree's section. B, the Huron and Natchez natives evidently made demands upon French colonists in order to maintain their own perceived best interest. Yes, that's found on one of the second to last number of the Southern Colonies handout. C, African-American slaves took advantage of an acute need for their labor in South Carolina. Yes, there's a section just on that. D, women acquiring their political and economic rights early in the Chesapeake, even if socially they were still stifled and expectations for them to remain ladylike. There is some truth to that, but it's not mentioned in any of the numbers. So that's the only one you will not find in the Southern Colonies assignment. So D is the one that doesn't fit. And please note, okay, guys, this is the only test of the three that I'm going to go through every number for the simple reason is just I want you to get on your feet and learn the manner by which I put these tests together. And yeah, so almost without exception, test one is the only one that I go through all the numbers like this. All right. Number 22, Alan Brinkley contends in the textbook that the Spanish command over Indian labor did not fully meet the demands for labor, so they opted for African slaves subsequently. Yes, he does contend that. And that kind of dovetails, right, with the number that you see in the Southern Colonies handout that contends very controversially that the option for African slaves was an economic, pragmatic option, not necessarily a racist option. Number 23, which of the following was mentioned as factual support of the thesis that slavery was not a racist, but practical and convenient institution? Diminishing numbers and reliability of white indentured servants? Absolutely. The biological success of African Americans against New World pathogens? Yes. Remember, they stereotype them as being more sturdy and hardy in their physical constitution. And that was another justification for using Black slaves. C, diplomacy with Native American tribes? Absolutely. In some regions, at some points, they could not use Native Americans as a viable option for labor because they were trying to avoid further war with the Native American tribes. So it's all the above. 24, the instructors cited Howard Zinn's take on Bacon's Rebellion as a possible microcosm or mini example of all of the following except or but. Capitalism created the incentive that prompted colonists to increase cultural productivity, which enabled the Virginia joint stock investors to pay off investors and still afford to grant freedom dues. No, that's not true. That's the one you're picking. But I did mention the other two. An inequitable society plagued by false promises will lead to rebellion. And C, many Southern governments and planters may have opted for slave labor after this rebellion by white indentured servants and ex-indentured servants. Number 25, which of the following was not mentioned in class pertaining to the alleged conditions endured by African slaves? The official slave codes provided a legal foundation for abuse as they permitted harsh punishments of slaves for tiny infractions and little accountability of masters and overseers for chastising them. Absolutely. B, Fogel and Ingerman's thesis that slaves' conditions were not so terrible because it was in the best economic interest of their masters to keep them healthy and strong, has withstood scrutiny. Well, no. Remember when I have the section that says, of course, slave conditions were awful. I argue against Fogel and Ingerman's thesis. So B is the one that doesn't fit. C, Madam's diaries, historical notices in newspapers and almanacs, excavated skeletal remains suggest that there was a lot of physical and emotional torment. Absolutely. And that's all found in that section. Number 26, French Louisiana's official and unofficial defiance of old world mercantilist restrictions as far as who can do what economically for non-nobles was depicted in the Southern Colonies handout as having emanated from genuine egalitarian idealism of her leaders. No, as stated in the very title of that section, I contend it was by accident. So 26 is false. 27, the French were depicted in the Southern Colonies handout as having greatly abused their strength in numbers and in resources in order to dictate terms to the Native Americans. No, if you read that section, it was just the opposite of that. The Native Americans bullied them, known as agency in the history books. Notice I gave previous semesters this because I didn't think that I had covered it. So this might be on the format of the one on the test, which I need to get rid of. I need to erase that. But anyway, so it looks like I'm giving you this one anyway. The author of Albion Seed suggests all the following except, and you look at C, that most English immigrants to the Southern colonies were liberty-loving, egalitarian Democrats. No, remember the gentry class, the well-to-do plantation owners from England came and largely migrated to the South, especially in Virginia. Number 29, which of the following does not match? Roger Williams was depicted as a well-meaning progressive advocate for religious freedom, which may have been encouraged by the intolerant mistreatment he had endured from Puritan authorities in Boston. Yes, it's very short in the section, but it's in there on the revisionist section of Puritan New England. B, William Penn was depicted as relatively sincere in his Quaker conversion and in his desire to embody meekness and brotherly love in issuing his Charter of Liberties and his proclamation of religious freedom in Pennsylvania. Yes, that was depicted in the court history section on him. C, Dutch New Netherlands was depicted as having transferred tolerant policies back from the Netherlands to the New World without a hint of ulterior motives. That's the one that I do not do, right? I contend that absolutely there were economic ulterior motives. So C is the one that doesn't match. Number 30, William Penn renounced his autocratic rule over Pennsylvania, willingly granting political rights and powers and economic resources and opportunities to commoners, including some marginalized and persecuted. Absolutely, as I mentioned today in my little mini lecture. 31, while Penn showed courtesy and respect to Native Americans regarding diplomacy, evidence suggests that he also enthusiastically pressed the tribes to sell him territory without seeming concern for their future. I just mentioned that as well. 32, coverage of the New England colonies entailed the concession that some of their institutions were relatively, compared to others, democratic and progressive. Yes. 33, class coverage of the New England colonies conceded that Puritans could be overbearing or tyrannical in their demands for conformity and in their angst-filled covenant notion, and outright imperialist bullies in their foreign policy. Absolutely. 34, an argumentative section contends that the court history notion that the Dutch colonizers of New England were progressive cosmopolitans practicing tolerance on principle, implying that official Dutch tolerance in later New York may have been at least partially due to economic concerns. That's redundant, but yes, that is true. 35, according to Alan Brinkley, this is another textbook one, the British Navigation Acts were stifling to American colonists as they successfully upheld Mercantilist policies? No. As we'll get to just after this test, it's tied to a famous thesis. Brinkley contends the opposite. So 35 is false. Number 36, which of the following is false regarding the sacred expedition? It marked what the Spanish officially declared to be a more peaceful colonization of Upper as opposed to Baja California. Yes. It initiated a Spanish colonization pattern of establishing missions, pueblos or cities or towns, presidios, military forts, and haciendas, and farms and ranches. Yes. C, Spanish missions have consistently and universally been praised. No, of course not. Revisionist historiography contends that they were ethnocentric tyrants, the missionaries. 37, in the St. Lawrence River and Ohio Valley, tribes like the Iroquois took advantage of European demand for furs and military ensconced themselves into an economically vital partner position. Absolutely. And that's another one that I wasn't sure if I had made clear in class, so I gave it to the class. St. Augustine, number 38, established by in Florida by the Spanish, is the oldest surviving Euro-American city. That is true. So notice that's not argumentative, like most of my questions. I just thought that was kind of a FYI one that's interesting to remember. 39, the Puritan societal notion of the covenant arguably formed the foundation for their tolerance of individuals' lifestyles. No way. We talked about that. They spied on their own people and reported them. So that one's false. Number 40, Tories in the English Parliament during the 1770s allied themselves with the colonists in demanding colonial rights as English subjects. No, the Whigs did. The Tories were conservative and wanted to put the Americans in their place. So 40 is false. All right. So are there any questions? All right. So I'll tell you what, just as I did last time, those who were present today, since we covered two things, I'm going to give you extra credit on both. All right. So I'll give you extra credit for the Northern Colonies assignment. And just as soon as I can, Nayeli. All right. I'll work on this to try to have this by sometime this afternoon. No problem. All right. So thank you. Yeah. Right. What you want me to go back over question 6? Let's see here. Number 6. At the time of Spanish colonization of the Americas, Western Europe was arguably slowly transitioning toward a limitedly and brutally capitalistic economy. Yes, that is in number 1, section number 1 of the Southern Colonies handout. So based upon that handout, that is true. And then someone just asked me about assignment number 1. What may that question be? No problem. Oh, okay. You resubmitted the correct one. Okay, good. All right. All right, I've written it down now. No problem. Oh, that's right. That's right. I responded to you about that. So absolutely, I will go back to that, and you're very welcome for the extra credit. No, it's fine, Benjamin. That happens. To be honest, that same mistake happens every semester. I'm just glad that you rectified it so quickly. All right, no problem. Okay. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and bid you adieu. Good luck on test 1 and on the Northern Colonies assignment. And yeah, I will hopefully see you on Thursday. Okay. You have a good day as well. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Okay. Thank you.